Hi, everybody. Welcome. As usual, it's 11:59 right now. As usual, we'll wait till about 1 minute after noon before we get started to just allow other people time to join us. So we'll hang tight for another 2 minutes or so, and then I'll get started. But thank you for joining us today. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. We're going to be talking about literature reviews today. This workshop is actually quite short, maybe even under 20 minutes, mainly because literature reviews are so dependent. The actual format and what goes in a literature review is so dependent on your topic. So I'll give you a general overview of what a literature review is. But if you have further questions, you can of course ask me after the webinar today, and or make an appointment with me or one of the other tutors if you are working on a literature review this semester. Perhaps you're working on a capstone, and we're happy to give you advice on your specific literature review. Okay, I think many of you have been to Writing Lab webinars before, but I do see a couple of what I think are new names. So just a little bit of housekeeping. My name is Charla Rivera. I'm the director of the Writing Lab. This is an ongoing series of webinars on writing topics and academic research topics. Everybody, when you join this workshop, you're automatically muted, and I do ask that you remain muted throughout the body of the presentation. And then if you have any questions at the end, you can feel free to unmute yourself. If you do have any questions while I'm talking, you can feel free. I have my chat box open this whole time. So if you have any questions while I'm talking and you want to get it in before you forget, you can feel free to just type it in the chat, and I'll respond to the questions as I see them as we go. Okay, so let's get started talking about literature reviews. So first, what is a literature review? A literature review can be a simple summary of important sources, but it's generally more than that. In fact, a lot of professors complain when they get literature reviews that just read like a list of summaries. Okay, that's not really the purpose of a literature review. Okay, generally a literature review integrates the sources. So rather than just saying, okay, source A says this, source B says this, source C says this, and just doing it as a list, instead, a literature review is going to pull out the different ideas that come up on a topic and kind of sort the sources by that. So you might say sources A and B agree with each other on this idea, but source B and C go on to say da 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 da. So in that way, you're not necessarily talking about one source at a time, but instead you're integrating them so that it reads as one coherent paper that flows rather than a list of summaries. Okay, like I said, it groups them by categories, and I'll talk about the different categories that we can use a little bit later. But again, you're not just listing sources, you are grouping them. You're doing some thought exercises yourself to decide how you're going to group all of your sources together. Okay? A literature review also gives context to the overall field of research. You've heard me say before, if you've been to previous webinars, that research is a conversation. And when you are presenting your own research, you're really joining an ongoing conversation. So the literature review is kind of like the previously on, okay? It's where you're saying, okay, this is what my topic is, and this is what has already been said about my topic. This is the conversation up until me, okay? So you're just kind of giving the overall context, the overall ideas, the themes that come up in your topic before you present your actual ideas or your actual research, okay? If you're writing something longer, and I mean like longer than your capstone, if you ever go on to do some more research, some really heavy duty research, the literature review might actually be included in your research proposal. So before you actually do the rest of your research, you might actually do a literature review as part of your proposal if you are applying for a grant, or if you go on to get your PhD or something like that. You might do your literature review much earlier in the proposal side of things, rather than the way it generally is structured at SCS in your capstones. Your literature review typically is a chapter within your capstone. So depending on what type of research you're doing, what kind of program you're in or anything like that, a literature review may be a chapter in your thesis or capstone, or it may come on the proposal side. But generally for most of you, you might write a mini literature review for your proposal, but the bulk of your lit review will come in as an actual chapter of your capstone. So like I said, otherwise it's in the body of your paper. So why do we do literature reviews? Doing a literature review helps you make sure that you're not reinventing the wheel. It helps you kind of really conceptualize the ideas and research that have come before you, so that you can make sure that, okay, somebody has not already said or done this before. I really am contributing something new, okay? Like I said, it builds that context, okay? It lets you know, it lets your reader know what the conversation in this particular topic has already been about before you joined, okay? Now, those of you who were at last week's, I think it was last week's presentation about annotated bibliographies, you might be asking yourself, but didn't I just review all of the sources or all of the ideas when I did my annotated bibliography? Yeah, sort of. Your annotated bibliography can help you get an overview of the research that's been done. But remember, the annotated bibliography is just a list. There's no point in your annotated bibliography where you as a researcher, or you as an academic, you as a thinker, are connecting any of the ideas within across the studies that you have put into your annotated bibliography. The annotated bibliography is purely a list, okay? Again, and you're hearing me say this at every slide, but this is really important, that your literature review is making connections between and across the studies and ideas, okay? It is not simply a list. So a literature review is written as a narrative, okay? It reads like an essay. In fact, if you think about a lot of the research papers that you might have written in undergrad, where you were using 5 sources and you didn't do any of your own research, you were just kind of summarizing the research there. Most of the papers that you're writing at the undergraduate level kind of actually fit into the literature review frame rather than true research, okay? So it's written like an essay. A literature review reads like it's an essay, okay? Again, synthesis. So synthesis is similar to what I'm saying about making connections, okay? You are creating categories to put the sources in. You are creating these categories yourself, or you're using a framework from one of your sources already, and you are showing how they connect together. And I'm really hammering this one home, because when I talk to professors about what types of things their students need to work on as a whole, the term synthesis or integrating ideas comes up from every single professor. So it's really, really really important that you are synthesizing ideas, that you are showing clear connections between the sources that you use, okay? So that's why I'm highlighting this, okay? So the structure of your literature review. A literature review generally includes the following things, okay? So you might, at the beginning of your literature review, or if this is a capstone, this might actually just go into your introduction or background section, but you might give an overview of the topic, okay? And at the beginning of your literature review, you might talk about the objectives of your literature review. So within that, you might talk about the type of categories that you used when organizing your sources. Or you might also explain why you're including some sources and not others. So for example, if you were doing some sort of research, let's say you're going to send out a survey to people about your topic, and you found some similar studies where people were sending out surveys. You may decide to include only studies that had at least 100 respondents to their surveys, and then not include anybody that had 50, for example. This is just an example. So you might include in your literature review the criteria that you used when you were deciding which sources to include, okay? So if you only used certain sample sizes, then say that. If you were only looking at people from this particular way of thinking, then say that. But if you had particular criteria for inclusion, then you should explain that in your literature review, okay? This is what I've said before, explaining each work and how it compares to its peers. So we're integrating our ideas, okay? You might also make conclusions about which works are most successful. Again, this is going to depend on your topic. If you are doing something that purely is research, where you're sending out surveys or something that is actual quantitative research, then you might talk about, successful studies that have been done in the past versus not successful ones. You can make conclusions about that and evaluate them within your literature review as well. And this is really important, really, really important. In fact, I feel like I should actually highlight this in the color. After you've talked about everything that has been going on in the conversation before you get there, you also need to talk about the gaps that still remain, because hopefully your research is trying to fill in one or more of these gaps that exist. Okay, so if everybody is looking at the research in one particular way, but you have an idea to look at it in a different way, talk about how that gap is there and how you'd like to fill it. Okay, or maybe you can only find small research studies that are just maybe case studies of one or two people, and you're saying, well, for this topic we really need to branch out and look at larger samples, for example. Then that could be a gap that you are filling. But it's really, really important to not just explain the conversation that has happened before you, but also explain what part you are going to play in that overall conversation. So what has been lacking before you joined, okay? It's really important to do that, okay? One little note that I want to say, with a capstone, if anybody is writing capstone, and most of you, if you're doing a literature review, are writing capstone, generally capstones aren't long enough for you to need to worry about meta discourse within your literature review. Meta discourse is language where you say something like, in this section, I ... Generally, a capstone is not long enough to require meta discourse like that. If your professor likes it or your professor requires it, then obviously go with what your professor is saying. But for a capstone, it's more like if you're writing a book, you might describe what happens in each chapter. But for a capstone, it's generally not long enough to need that sort of meta discourse. But like I say, check with your professor. So how can we group work? So I say that you put your works into categories that you might decide. What are the types of categories that you might put the studies or research into? You could do it chronologically. So if you might look at the evolution of a particular type of study or a particular way of thinking. in which case it might make sense to start with the beginning and work through it chronologically. Okay, that's one option. Provenance. Provenance is where it's coming from. So if different types of researchers, maybe researchers from different countries or different language backgrounds or different religion backgrounds or whatever, if it seems to make a difference, you might group things based on the provenance, which is like the origin of the research, okay? You might group it based on the discipline or field within your field. You're going to know this a little better than I do, but every field tends to have subtopics, right? So you might divide it up based on discipline or field of the researchers, okay? Attitude, perspective. So if some people feel very positively about the topic and some people feel very negatively about the topic, you might organize them based on positive and negative. Now that's kind of black and white. What's more likely is that you have one camp that thinks about one thing slightly different than the other camp. It's generally not quite so cut and dry as positive, negative, but you get the sense that you can divide them up based on their attitude or their perspective, okay? You could also divide them up based on theoretical framework, especially this, something that's very useful is if you can find another framework that's done by another researcher. You can design your own theoretical framework, or you can find another researcher who has designed their own framework and apply it to your research. Again, it's very topic dependent. Some students might be applying an already existing framework to their research, and then other students just create their own framework, which is possible as well. So, but it is one way to divide things, okay? You can also do it by genre or type. So maybe you divide it by qualitative research being things that you cannot really measure by numbers per se. You're measuring things more by ideas. So maybe you do, you talk about qualitative research versus quantitative research, which is measured by numbers. So you could look at it that way. Again, it depends a lot on your field and a lot on your topic and the actual sources that exist for your topic. So you may not know until you actually start doing your research what kind of group, category, or framework will work until you've actually started reading everybody, okay? Oh, sample size, which I've already talked about a little bit, okay? So it's really important that I make it clear that this is not an exhaustive list. There are many other ways to group things, and you might find what comes most naturally to you or to your topic rather as you go, okay? And again, it's really important that you think about what's the most natural grouping for your specific research that you found. There's not one of these that's particularly better or worse than the others. It's really going to come down to your topic and the type of research that's already been done. Okay, so something that can be really helpful is for you to kind of brainstorm on your own, maybe use a mind map. I remember when I was in grad school, I wasn't very big on mind maps, but I did have one paper that just had a massive expanse of ideas, and I had a hard time bringing all of my authors together in a way that made sense. And so I ended up making a mind map so that I could draw lines between the authors and say, okay, this person agrees with this person, but disagrees over here. And I was able to draw lines and really start to see the web of how everybody connected. And I was able to see the themes that appeared. So it can help to do a little bit of pre-writing activity once you've done some research. If you're having trouble coming up with the categories or a way to organize everyone, it can help to do some of this. Okay. All right, so some tips for writing your literature reviews. Okay. Again, you want to think about not just summarizing, but also synthesizing. So making sure that you're integrating and connecting the sources. Okay. Like I was saying, connect them with one another as well as your own ideas. You also want to use evidence. So actually paraphrase or quote the ideas that you are referring to so that you can kind of prove it. Okay, so make sure you're using citations, in other words. Excuse me. Be selective. You only have a limited amount of time in your literature review, or a limited amount of pages or words in your literature review. So you can't talk about absolutely every idea from every author. One author, maybe you have an amazing 60-page paper from an author, but really there's only one idea in it that applies to your entire paper. So it doesn't mean, so you really cannot spend time summarizing all 60 pages, and it's better to just be selective and choose that one key idea that's going to fit. Okay, so your literature review does not and really cannot include everything from everyone, so you have to be selective. Okay, and it's also important to remember that in your literature review, you are writing basically a summary of the entire field, not a particular work. Okay, so you're not summarizing just author A, you're summarizing the entire field. Okay. I'll say this in a couple of weeks again when we get to in-text citations, but really in the graduate level, you want to use quotes sparingly. You want to quote as little as possible. You want to paraphrase more often than you quote. And I'll go into more depth about this in a couple of weeks in the in-text citation presentation. Okay. You also want to be careful when you're paraphrasing. You want to make sure that you are keeping the ideas true to the original source. Okay, this is kind of really all part of using evidence. So making sure that you are referring to the actual original source and citing it. Okay. But you do want to make sure that in your literature review, you keep your own voice, because this is kind of your contribution to the conversation. This is still your research. So you can keep your own ideas, keep your own voice while doing all of that, because it is really important to view your own research as valid and as a valid contribution to the field. You're joining the conversation and you have a right to speak, essentially. Okay. So again, this was just kind of the general overview of what a literature review is, what goes into it. It's really hard to give very general information about a literature review because it is so topic dependent. So if anybody has any questions, I will hang tight here for a few minutes to answer any questions. If you are working on a literature review right now or will be in the future, feel free to make an appointment with a tutor. We're happy to help you with that. We can help you with any stage of it, okay? So again, I'll hang tight for a few minutes if you need to go. Thank you for joining us today. All of the meat of the presentation is over and we're just doing questions. So if you do need to go, feel free.